Good day. Over the last few hours, there's been a few reports coming from the battlefields of Ukraine, making it more difficult to get a sense of what is actually going on the battlefields, though one gets the sense that lots of things are actually happening. It's just that they're not being reported. Perhaps the most interesting fact in terms of actual fighting is that it does increasingly seem as if the focus of the next Russian offensive after the fall of Soledar will not be Bakhmut itself, though fighting is still going on in and around all of Bakhmut. I discussed yesterday that there now seems to be a major fight underway for the village of Kleshayevka on the southwest of Bakhmut itself, an important village which needs to be captured. If the ring around Bakhmut is to be closed and the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut are to be placed inside a cauldron, as the Russians call it, in other words, a ring from which they can't break out from, a trap, if you will. Anyway, fighting still apparently is going on in Kleshayevka. Fighting is still going on further north in another village, Krasnaya Gora, which is to the northeast of Bakhmut. But as I say, we're not getting a huge amount of information as of the making of this video about the progress of the fighting there. Instead, we're getting hints, suggestions that the major Russian pressure will not be on Bakhmut, but rather on Siversk, the town. It was a relatively small place, around 10,000 people before the war, but the town at the very northern end of the so-called Zelensky line, which continues to be held by Ukraine and whose fall would mean the unraveling of the Zelensky line at its most northerly end. Now, there are again reports that General Zaluzhny has told President Zelensky that the Ukrainian troops, must be withdrawn from Siversk. Supposedly or allegedly, with the fall of Soledar, with the Russians now essentially in control, or very soon in control, of the highway from Bakhmut, from Soledar to from Bakhmut to Siversk, as they soon will be. If Ukrainian troops remain in Siversk for much longer, they risk finding themselves in a cauldron as well. And General Zaluzhny has apparently told President Zelensky that this is unacceptable and that the troops must therefore be withdrawn, which would mark a further unraveling of the Zelensky line, which has now been severely punctured following the fall of Soledar. Well, we don't know whether that has indeed been General Zaluzhny's advice to President Zelensky, but the very fact that there's a lot of chatter about Siversk does suggest that something is going on around Siversk. Chatter, I should say, both on the Russian telegram channels and the Ukrainian telegram channels. All of these sources seem to be focusing now on what's going on in Siversk. So maybe, just maybe, there's going to be some sort of Russian attack or encirclement operation around Siversk. Possibly, just possibly, the Ukrainians may withdraw from Siversk before that encirclement operation happens. I would just say one thing about Siversk. Shortly after the fall of Lysychansk, there was a great deal of discussion about which part of the Zelensky line the Russians would attack first. And there was discussion most notably, I remember, on the Military Summary channel about whether the Russians would go for Bakhmut or whether they would go for Siversk. And the Military Summary channel, Dima, thought that for all sorts of, I thought, rather good reasons, Siversk would be the main priority. But in fact, and as it turned out, the Russians, before they focused fully on Siversk, focused instead on Bakhmut. Now, one of the reasons why the capture of Siversk might be important is because, firstly, it would severely undermine the entire Ukrainian position in northern Donbass, but also it would make extremely difficult, perhaps impossible, these Ukrainian attacks or attempted attacks on the Kremenaya-Svatovo region. And it's been suggested that, in fact, without Siversk, the whole Ukrainian position in this part of the battlefronts along the northern Donbass and southern Kharkiv region would actually become untenable, and with the Russian forces steadily pressing towards Kupiansk in Kharkiv region, that in effect all of those gains that the Ukrainians achieved in that part of the the conflict zone, as a result of their Kharkiv offensive of September, that all of that would unravel and perhaps not fully, but to a great extent, go into reverse. Now, as I have said many times, numerous times, I'm not somebody who either reads maps very well or who has much grasp of military tactics. But to the extent that I'm able to read maps and get a sense of the overall contours of a battle, it does seem to me that if the Ukrainian forces in Siversk are indeed pulled out, or if instead they are encircled and Siversk does indeed fall after a major battle, well then, and at that point, the whole situation of the Ukrainian forces in northern Donbass will become untenable. It will be realistically impossible for the Ukrainians to maintain any offensive in the Kremenaya-Svatovo area, and it's highly likely, I would have thought, that Ukrainian positions in places like Liman, which the Ukrainians captured in October, would become untenable as well. So that's how it looks to me. But as I said, we will see whether this is indeed the Russian plan. We will see whether, in fact, the Ukrainians do decide to withdraw from Siversk. For the record, I think that President Zelensky, if he is indeed getting advice to withdraw from Siversk, is going to vigorously resist it. First of all, it's clear that President Zelensky doesn't like retreats. He doesn't really countenance withdrawals. But secondly, if the loss of Siversk is going to be as consequential as that, if it is indeed going to jeopardize the results of the supposedly successful Kharkiv offensive of the early autumn, well then, in that case, he's going to be especially reluctant to countenance a withdrawal, because doing so would in effect take away the gloss from one of his, or rather Ukraine's, most important victories or successes during the war, which is, of course, the Kharkiv counteroffensive. And that, by the way, brings me back to some of the things that the German General Erich Wad, said over the course of that interview, which he gave a short time ago to the German media, and which was I discussed in a program recently, and which was, of course, also discussed very thoroughly by the veteran journalist, reporter of Russian affairs, John Helmer, in his website, exceptional website, Dancing with Bears. And General Vad actually, over the course of that interview, made some really interesting points. And I'll just read, this is a machine translation, part of this interview, which I think is really quite revealing about what the German military, and it's interesting to see that Vad at this point is clearly talking with knowledge of what is being discussed on the part of the German military, what the German military think of all of these Ukrainian offensives. So Vad was asked this question: you two have been attacked for calling for negotiations. And then Vad replies, yes, as did Inspector General of the German Armed Forces, General Eberhard Zorn, who, like me, warned against overestimating the Ukrainians' regionally limited offensives in the summer months. Military experts who know what's going on amongst the secret services, what it's like on the ground, and what war really means, are largely excluded from the discourse. They don't fit in with media opinion forming. We are largely experiencing a media synchronization that I have never experienced in the Federal Republic. Now, notice those particular words. Military people, and we're told that General Eberhard Zorn, the Inspector General of Germany's armed forces, warned against overestimating the Ukrainians' regionally limited offensives in the summer months. Now, what Vad is clearly referring to is not the offensives that took place in the summer months, because Ukraine didn't carry out any offensives in the summer months. He's clearly referring to the offensives Ukraine carried out in the early autumn in Kharkiv region and in Kherson region. And apparently the German military were warning the politicians, or trying to warn the politicians, that the effect, the success of these offensives was being overestimated, and that they were not as consequential as the media was saying. Well, now perhaps with all of this talk about what is going on in Siversk, or what might happen in Siversk, we see the force of that, because it turns out that the Ukrainians in Kharkiv region lost an awful lot of men, recapturing the territory that they did capture in Kharkiv region, capturing Izium and Kupiansk and Liman and those sort of places. But with the fall of Solidar and the likely pending fall of Siversk, all of that sacrifice may turn out to be for nothing, and all of the gains that were achieved or appear to have been achieved as a result of that offensive in Kharkiv region, Ukraine's first success in the war, well, all of that is going to be reversed. In other words, that offensive had only an ephemeral effect. It did not actually, or in any significant way, really change the situation on the battlefronts. And as to what General Vad really believes is the true battlefront, he says this, and this is in connection with deliveries of tanks, and I'm going to come to that in a short time. He talks about what is going to be the overall effect of the fighting, where the direction of the fighting is. And he says that the question arises again as to what would happen with the deliveries of tanks to take over. The Russians are clearly advancing in eastern Ukraine, in the Bakhmut area. They will probably have completely conquered Donbass before very long. One only has to consider the numerical superiority of the Russians over Ukraine. Russia can mobilize up to 2 million reservists. The West can send 100 Marders and 100 Leopard 2s there, but that isn't going to change anything in the overall military situation. And the all-important question is how to end such a conflict with a warlike nuclear power, mind you, the most powerful nuclear power in the world, whilst avoiding World War III. So clearly, General Vard and the German military, who after all have a history of, long military history behind them. I don't know how competent German generals are nowadays, but anyway, General Vard is telling the politicians, the German military has been telling the politicians, all these Ukrainian advances in Kharkiv, in Kherson region, they don't, in the end, mean very much, certainly not as much as the media thinks they do. The real battle is taking place in Bakhmut, in Soledar, in Siversk, though it should be said that General Vard doesn't mention Siversk. In Donbass, in other words, where the war has been fought all along, and that the Russians are and have been continuing to make progress in Donbass all the time, and that they are an unstoppable force. Even if you send 100 Leopards and 100 Marders, 100 tanks and 100 infantry fighting vehicles, it's not going to make any difference, and that before very long, Donbass will fall, inflicting upon Ukraine what could be a terminally effective defeat. So that's what the German military is saying, and we see how the possible fall of Siversk might contribute to that and might corroborate that analysis. Anyway, so much for Siversk. There's been another very interesting revelation. Now, yesterday in my video, I discussed a report by a Spanish journalist from El País, who's visited the military fronts near Bakhmut, and who's reported that the entire area around there is crammed with Ukrainian troops, material, logistical supplies, you name it, that an enormous proportion of the Ukrainian army is in fact concentrated in that particular area near Bakhmut. And the Moon of Alabama, Bernhardt, at the Moon of Alabama, has actually done some reporting on this. He's actually looked at the situation in and around Bakhmut. He's checked out what the overall situation, the military situation is around there. And he's done that by looking at something called the Military Land Deployment Map. Again, I'm not able to read these maps very well, but Bernhardt has a greater ability to do so than I can. And he says this, I count 27 brigade-size Ukrainian formations in this area. This is the area near Bakhmut. 27 brigade-sized formations. The usual size of a brigade is 3,000 to 4,000 men with hundreds of all kinds of vehicles. If all brigades had their full strength, that force would count as 97,500 men. Well, I'm going to say straight away that I think that is certainly wrong. I am absolutely sure that even brigade-sized formations in the Ukrainian army have long since ceased to be up to full strength. And I don't think we're talking about 100,000 men in the front lines around Bakhmut. But nonetheless, this is an extraordinary concentration of force, and it's in some ways a bizarre one. And Bernhard says it's an insane number of Ukrainian units deployed on what is only a 50-kilometer, 30-mile long sector of the front. 27 brigades, let's say 27 brigades, many no doubt severely under strength, but a disproportionate amount of the Ukrainian army is now located around Bakhmut. And Bernhard then goes on to say that General Zaluzhny, he assumes it's General Zaluzhny, let's say the Ukrainian High Command, have pulled in units from other fronts like the Kremenaya-Svatovo sector further north to feed them into Bakhmut. And Bernhard also makes the obvious point that this has minimized any chance the Ukrainians have of making advances in other areas. Well, I think that's only one point one could make about this extraordinary concentration of Ukrainian force in and around Bakhmut. The next one, I think, and perhaps the single most important one, is that with so many Ukrainian troops concentrated around Bakhmut, it is extremely unlikely indeed that the Ukrainians are going to easily withdraw from Bakhmut. The investment Ukraine has made in trying to hold on to Bakhmut is simply too great. Too big a proportion of the Ukrainian army has been concentrated in trying to hold on to this particular town, which is clearly seen, as has been discussed many times, both on this channel and on others, it's clearly seen as the linchpin of Ukrainian defenses, not just along the Zelensky line, but presumably Donbass as well. So the Ukrainians have concentrated a disproportionate amount of their army to defend Bakhmut, and that suggests that it's going to be psychologically and perhaps tactically very, very difficult now to admit that this investment in men and machines to defend Bakhmut has been wasted, and to pull back however bad the situation in Bakhmut becomes. The second point to make is that clearly Bakhmut is seen by the Ukrainian High Command, not just by President Zelensky, but by General Zaluzhny and the General Staff, as a place of great strategic importance. Otherwise, why concentrate such an enormous force to try to defend it and to defend the surrounding area? The third is that this very large proportion of the Ukrainian army, let's assume that it doesn't number 100,000 men, that all of these units are operating at only half strength, we would still be talking about 50,000 men. 50,000 men. And as we see the on-the-spot reporting of the journalist from El País, well, he appears to confirm that 50,000 men have been pinned down trying to defend Bakhmut. That's roughly the force that Ukraine was alleged to have committed in the Kherson counteroffensive. I would actually go further. The Russian forces stationed west of the Dnieper River, which were throughout September and October, successfully defending Kherson region west of the Dnieper River, we now know numbered around 20,000 men. The Ukrainian forces defending Bakhmut, this one town, are much greater than that. At least, I'm guessing now, but at least double that number, perhaps more, depending on how up to strength Ukrainian brigades nowadays are. So clearly, this is a place of importance. Otherwise, it's inconceivable that the Ukrainians would be defending it to the extent that they are. And clearly, its loss would be extremely consequential. But thirdly, you have this very large Ukrainian force, 50,000 men, and faced by actual Russian forces, it's not able to take the offensive. You would have thought that 50,000 men concentrated in this area on a small front of, 30 miles long would be able to advance, not just hold their positions. It seems that they cannot do so, and that tells us a great deal about the actual balance of forces in Donbass. And I'd be very interested to know why. I've said that one of the frustrating things about the Ukrainian war is that though we have a great deal of public information about the positions of Ukrainian units, we don't have anything analogous to that with Russian units. But the fact that there are 50,000 Ukrainian troops stationed around Bakhmut, but they're not able to attack, that they've been pushed back onto the defense, suggests that the Russian forces that they're coming up against are very powerful indeed, even if most of those Russian forces do not seem to be directly engaged in fighting. And I say the last because, as Yevgeny Prigozhin has repeatedly insisted, and he's the chief of the Wagner organization, the troops who are actually carrying out the storming of places like Soledar and Klesheyevka and Krasnaya Gora and ultimately of Bakhmut itself are Wagner organization troops. They're not part of the regular Russian army. Now, I do not believe that the Wagner organization by itself can pin down 50,000 Ukrainian troops. So there must be many, many more Russian formations there providing support to the troops of the Wagner organization. But it remains the case that they are the spearhead, the Wagner organization troops are the spearhead, and they are nonetheless able to make progress against this enormous Ukrainian defending force. And that does beg some important questions about the relative capability, if you like, of the opposing forces. I've said in the past that in every encounter battle that I know of, except perhaps one in Kherson region, whenever the Russians and the Ukrainians have encountered each other on a battlefield, the Russians have won. Well, we can see that in the Bakhmut area, that is very, very much the case. And then Bernhard makes the point, which is absolutely correct, and it's been made by many people, it's been made by myself, it's been made by people far more expert in this matter than I am, people like Douglas Macgregor, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, Scott Ritter, others. Ukrainian losses in this area have been horrendous, and the reason they are horrendous is because this enormous concentration of Ukrainian troops defending Bakhmut has made for excellent targets for the Russian artillery. Now, Bernhard goes into great details about how this is done. I'm not going to discuss that. I think it is a well-established fact. Even the Ukrainians admit that they've suffered enormously heavy losses in Bakhmut. Now, yesterday, I threw out the suggestion that the very large number of Ukrainian troops concentrated around Bakhmut, reported by that journalist from Al Pais, must make a tempting target, a tempting invitation, if you prefer, to the Russians for them to carry out some kind of encirclement exercise to try to sort of engulf all of these forces. You have a disproportionate part of the Ukrainian army in one place, and in fact, not just one place, but one relatively small place, and the temptation to try and encircle it, if that is possible, must be very strong, because if you can encircle this force and destroy it, well, it's highly likely that the Ukrainian army is going to be fatally weakened, to the point perhaps where its ability to continue the war might be severely compromised. Well, this isn't something that is discussed by Bernhard or by anyone else as far as I can see, but I throw it out again based on this information that we've seen. El Pais says tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops concentrated in this small area, and we've seen that the military land deployment map, and Bernhard, go ahead and confirm that this is the case. It seems to me that the possibility of some sort of encirclement or cauldron in this very limited area, you wouldn't need big arrows going over huge distances. That must be very real and very tempting, and I personally would be very surprised if people within the Russian military haven't at least considered the possibility. It may be difficult to carry out. There may be all kinds of logistical or topographical reasons. While it might not be possible, it could be that the Ukrainian fortifications in this area are just too strong to make that kind of encirclement possible. Who knows? I don't. But anyway, there it is. An extraordinarily large part of the Ukrainian military, judging by the unit that was fighting in Solidar, which was an airborne unit which apparently received some part of its training in Britain. Many of these are Ukraine's best troops. They are concentrated in one place where they do seem to be a tempting target, or so I would have thought, to the Russians, and where they might be finished off perhaps once and for all. Anyway, whilst I'm on this topic, and whilst I'm discussing Bernhard's latest piece, he does also mention something else, which is the very heavy losses in equipment that Ukraine has suffered. And this is, of course, something that Brian Beletic at the New Atlas talks about all the time, that Ukraine has suffered massive losses in terms of its tanks, its infantry fighting vehicles, its armoured vehicles, its artillery, and all those things. And obviously it received a whole lot of new kit from NATO over the course of the spring and summer, and this made possible those counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region. But all of that has been lost now, and Bernhard points out that the latest reports from the Russian military, in fact not latest, the reports from the Russian military for some time now, when they talk about missile and artillery strikes on Ukrainian formations talk, as they always have done, about the numbers of Ukrainian soldiers who were killed. That remains at roughly the same level as before. But in terms of tanks and armored vehicles, the Russians claim from each strike the destruction of one tank, one or two, or three armored vehicles, far fewer, in other words, very much fewer than had been the case earlier in the war, when the number of tanks and armored vehicles that the Russians claimed they were destroying in various missile and artillery strikes was always very much greater, by orders of magnitude. And this does indeed suggest that the Ukrainian military is lacking increasingly in armored vehicles, in tanks and in infantry fighting vehicles and other armored vehicles, that the reports that we've seen, the claims we've seen, the analysis we've seen from people like myself and Brian Beletic and Douglas McGregor and Scott Ritter and others, that Ukraine has burnt through its equipment. Firstly, the equipment it had when the war started, and secondly, the equipment it was supplied by the West in the spring and summer. Now that's all gone, and what it has are just the odd tank here, a couple of infantry fighting vehicles there, but nothing that in its totality can said to constitute a significant fighting punch. By the way, another person who made that point was Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vershinin in his latest discussion of the state of the war, which I discussed about a week, 10 days ago. And that, of course, brings us back to the subject of Western armored vehicle deliveries. Now, yesterday on the Duran, we were privileged to do a live stream with Brian Beletic himself, the authority on this issue. We talked about tank and infantry fighting vehicle deliveries. We spoke about the difficulties Ukraine would have in operating these Western tanks when they are supplied. We were privileged to have lots of people commenting on the threads and in the discussion who've served in various NATO militaries and who are familiar with these vehicles, with these tanks, who've actually operated them. I mean, just to give one example, I've had an email, private email from someone who's operated a Leopard 2, who served in a Leopard 2. I'm not going to discuss who this person is. I'm not going to give any details, but this person did make the point, for example, that Soviet tanks and Russian tanks to this day carry a big, what looks like a wooden log or pole when they move around on. And the reason they do that is because they use these poles or logs to pull themselves out of soft ground. And they can do that because they are very, very much lighter. Western tanks don't have that facility. They don't carry these kind of poles or logs. And given their weight, and we're talking about the weight of all of these tanks, the Leopard 2s, the Challenger 2s, the Abrams, it probably wouldn't work anyway if it was ever tried. That's just one example of the kind of very interesting and useful information that we've been receiving at the Duran from all sorts of people from our community, people who include people with the kind of background or the kind of technical knowledge and hands-on experience of trying to operate these vehicles. And the overwhelming consensus is that, these are not appropriate vehicles for the war that Ukraine is fighting. They're not the kind of vehicles that Ukraine could effectively use. I may have given the impression in one or two programs that I think poorly of these tanks. If so, Western tanks. If so, let me take that back entirely. I'm not an expert on tanks in any way. I'm fully willing to believe that the Leopard 2, when it was designed, and perhaps still, is a superb vehicle. So no doubt is the Abrams, and perhaps the Challenger 2 is as well. But the point is that they are intensive, maintenance-intensive, heavy vehicles designed to hold back a Soviet advance on the Central Front in Central Europe, in Germany, first and foremost, in the event of a World War III type scenario, such as people envisaged during the Cold War. Now, Germany, as we all know, is a heavily built up country. There's excellent metalled roads there. There's lots of towns and cities. The population densities are very high, and it's easy, or relatively easy, to keep tanks like that operating in that kind of landscape, to keep them maintained and operating. And of course you have the enormous logistical systems that Western militaries are able to bring to bear in that kind of operational environment. And no doubt these tanks are superbly adapted for fighting in those sort of conditions. These are not the conditions which exist in Ukraine, where population densities are low, where towns are isolated from each other, where roads are often narrow and not particularly well metalled, where bridges are probably lighter and may struggle. Some of the smaller bridges may struggle to cope with 70+ ton vehicles, and where logistics and maintenance is going to be an almost insuperable challenge. And one gets the sense from what General Vad is saying, and from another article which I read in the Daily Telegraph yesterday, that there are people in the British and German and American militaries who understand this. Now, in the Daily Telegraph yesterday, there was a very curious article from some commentator who explained why it was not a good idea to send Challenger 2s to Ukraine. This person spoke up, said that the Challenger 2s were outstanding tanks, but he pointed out that the British Army doesn't have many. It needs every single one to keep the entire tank fleet operating, if only because Challenger 2s taken out of service nonetheless remain an important source of spare parts for the operational fleet, which in Britain's case will soon number no more than about 150. And this person also made certain points about the maintenance demands, the heavy needs needed to keep Challenger 2s operating in the battlefields. This article couldn't straightforwardly come out and say this is a bad idea to send tanks at all. Let's give up on it. The person who writes it comes up with the absolutely fantastic idea, fanciful idea, that Britain might somehow arrange for Jordan to transfer its entire Challenger 1 fleet to Ukraine. 400 tanks apparently. Jordan is apparently in the process of taking them out of service. These are older tanks, much older tanks than the Challenger 2, but nonetheless, Challenger 2 is a derivative of the Challenger 1, just as the future Challenger 3 will be a derivative of the Challenger 2, and the Challenger 1 itself is apparently a derivative of the Chieftain tank that the British Army operated in the 60s. Well, that's all history. But anyway, this person suggested that the Challenger ones from Jordan would make a better fit for Ukraine. Well, he must know that there is almost no possibility of Jordan, which has good relations with Russia, agreeing to transfer its old Challenger 1 tanks to Ukraine. It's most unlikely, to put it mildly, that the Jordanians would agree to that. So that is a red herring argument, obviously put forward in order to soften the pill, soften the blow from this explanation that the supply of the Challenger 2s is a bad idea. But now we are getting more reason to think that there are more and more doubts about this whole thing within the Western militaries. Now, I've already discussed the various things that General Vad of the German military has to say. He's talked about this enormous build-up of military forces by the Russians in this area, about the fact that the Ukrainians are losing in Donbass, and that Donbass is likely to come under Russian control very soon. And we've seen how General Vad has said, well, what are 100 Leopard 2s and 100 Marder tanks going to achieve in this kind of situation? Well, I wonder whether this isn't what the German military are now telling the German government. They're saying to the German government, let's give up on this crazy idea of supplying Leopard 2s. It's not going to work. It's going to make the situation for Ukraine, if anything, even worse, because it's going to complicate their logistics. It will further antagonize the Russians. The optics from a Russian point of view of this are disastrous. German tanks once more operating on the territory of what was the Soviet Union and Tsarist Russia, and which the Russians say is part of the Russian Federation today. After the events of World War II and World War I, that is certainly not what the impression we want to give. And besides, it isn't going to work anyway. So let's not even think about it. We don't have hundreds of Leopard 2s to give away. The total number of Leopard 2s that exist in the world is not so great. Many of them are in poor condition and practically unusable. Many of them are needed to supplement the stock of Leopard 2s that are still operating. Many of them are older models anyway, perhaps not best suited for modern war, and none of them are really suitable for operating in Ukraine. And I say that because we've now had a whole succession of decisions from some Western governments which appear to be calling into question the entire idea of supplying tanks to Ukraine. First of all, the Spanish government appears to have ruled that out. And perhaps in order to defend himself from criticism, because he's ruled out the supply of Spanish Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, the Spanish Prime Minister, Mr. Sanchez, has come out with an extraordinary, in my opinion, Orwellian or McCarthyist, if you prefer, comment about, we must in Europe work hard to eliminate all the Russian fifth column in our midst, that sort of thing. Very disturbing language, and unfortunately the kind of language that's become all too typical nowadays. As I said, I do wonder whether that might have been done in part to deflect criticism from Spain and from the Spanish government, from the usual sources, because Spain is apparently ruling out sending its Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. But more interestingly, there's now been some comments from Germany, and the Germans are apparently coming out. This is Scholz, and indeed Robert Habeck himself, that's the Vice Chancellor. They're coming out and making statements that Germany will not be alone in supplying tanks to Ukraine. And the way these comments from Scholz and Habeck and others are being framed is that they almost seem to be saying that Germany will only supply tanks to Ukraine if the United States supplies tanks to Ukraine also. And of course, as we know, the US military is apparently saying that they are dead against, strongly opposed to the supply of Abrams tanks to Ukraine, because they see these tanks as far too complex and maintenance intensive to operate effectively on this battlefield. So we see what is looking increasingly like a push from, I suspect, the uniformed military, a pushback against this whole idea of supplying tanks to Ukraine. And both General Vad's comments in Germany and this rather strange article in the Daily Telegraph, they both hint at this, that the uniformed military are advising against this. They're saying, look, things are not going well in Ukraine. Sending a couple of 100 tanks, 100 tanks or so isn't going to make any difference. Let's abandon this disastrous idea. It's not going to work. It might drag us into more and more things. We've provided Ukraine with all that we can, and let's not even think about going there. Well, that seems to be one particular pushback that we're now starting to see. Now, of course, it depends very much on events and on politics, how effective all this criticism is going to be. There's going to be a meeting soon in Ramstein. The British are doing everything they can to try to push their allies, the Germans and the Americans, but especially the Germans, to agreeing to supply Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. The Germans clearly are resisting, and it could be the case that this new German defense minister, a person about whom I know absolutely virtually nothing, Mr. Pistorius, is also going to push back against it. It's been pointed out that he was until fairly recently, until in fact the conflict began in February, a member of some kind of Russian-German friendship or cooperation group. I doubt that that means a great deal, but he does seem to have some sort of background in security matters. Perhaps he's more the sort of person who will listen to the kind of advice that comes from the uniformed military than the three last German defense ministers have done. One of those, by the way, was Ursula von der Leyen. Anyway, we'll see. But anyway, I thought these are interesting developments. And by the way, there's also been a very interesting article in the American military media, if I can put it like that, about the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. It strongly suggests that the Bradley also is not really a suitable weapon system for Ukraine. And the reason is that though the Bradley is said to be an exceptional infantry fighting vehicle, it can supposedly perform magnificently in war, it's again too complicated, too intensive for Ukraine to be able to use successfully. Now, this article is in 1945, which is, I suppose, a military magazine, or it certainly seems to be focused on the US military. I'm not a military person by any stretch, as I've discussed any number of times, but it does seem to say, it does seem to be written with a genuine degree of knowledge of the capabilities of the Bradley, and it makes some very telling points about the great difficulty that one of the countries to which the United States has supplied the Bradley, which is Lebanon, the enormous problems that Lebanon has been having in trying to integrate and use the Bradley effectively. And it points out that it's been 8 years since the inception of this program of giving the Lebanese army the Bradley and getting the Bradley integrated and effective in its operations. And even now, the Lebanese army has failed to fully master it. And the article says the main challenge is that the Bradley fighting vehicle is an extraordinarily high-tech and complex system of systems that require a substantial level of technical and tactical expertise at the user level and an extremely high level of technical expertise at higher echelons to maintain and logistically support. The US Army has a large number of specialized Bradley courses to train those assigned to units with Bradley fighting vehicles, including the Bradley Leader course and the Bradley Master Gunner course, and an entire military occupational specialty devoted to Bradley fighting vehicle maintenance. Additionally, Bradley fighting vehicle equipped US Army units rely on the greatest military in the world for provision of all things required to make and keep a Bradley fighting vehicle equipped unit mission capable. Even with the US Army's incredible logistics and support capability, it takes a dedicated months-long training period to prepare a Bradley fighting vehicle equipped unit for combat. Furthermore, the US just barely managed to maintain a Bradley fighting vehicle operational readiness rate above 90% in the 1990s, a rate that plummeted during operations in Iraq from 2003 to 2011. If the United States Army cannot maintain an adequate operational readiness rate for Bradley fighting vehicles deployed in combat, despite the enormous logistics capability of the United States military, one cannot realistically expect a foreign partner lacking those capabilities to do so or to quickly integrate and deploy Bradley fighting vehicles once received. And the article then goes on to say that it also requires technical assistance, field teams to support the Bradley fighting vehicle, field service representatives to provide high-level support, large quantities of ammunition for training and operations, testing and calibration equipment for the many technologically advanced systems, including, importantly, the TOW missile system, which cannot be safely operated without such equipment, conduct of fire trainers, high volumes of spare parts, and communication equipment, to name but a few. And then the article goes on to say that, a lot will depend on which models of the Bradley Ukraine were to get, but older models kept in storage might require refurbishment. It might take a while to get these in any sort of condition where they could be fit for combat use. And the article does say that Ukraine has already demonstrated an incredible capability to receive, integrate and deploy various complex weapon systems. But of course, that does beg many questions. And to be frank, I question whether that claim, if one really studies the situation on the battlefields, is really true. They've never been provided with a system as complex as these tanks and these infantry fighting vehicles, which are now being talked about. So, again, I wonder whether all of this, the fact that articles like this are starting to appear, may suggest that there is now some pushback from the military in the United States as well. And if there is, that would no doubt explain why they are so unwilling to provide Abrams tanks over and above these Bradley vehicles. They clearly understand that this whole idea of supplying Abrams tanks with their complex, maintenance-intensive and extremely thirsty gas turbine engines, it really isn't a practical idea for Ukraine. And it's starting to look as if some Germans are hiding behind the US's refusal to supply Abrams tanks to justify their decision not to supply Leopard 2 tanks. Well, we'll see what comes, because of course there are the countervailing pressures as well. Secretary of State Blinken has again made certain extraordinary comments about Ukraine. He's again spoken about the imperative of forcing the Russians back to their 1991 borders, which would imply, by the way, Ukraine capturing Crimea, which I don't think any military person any longer thinks is remotely possible. I think also, we also see how in Britain, people can change their views under these kind of political pressures. Back in the spring of 2022, Prime Minister Boris Johnson of Britain ruled out the supply of Challenger 2 tanks. His Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, who is still the British Defence Secretary, by the way, and who is an ardent supporter of Ukraine, said that the supply of Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine wouldn't work. Well, we see why. And yet we now see the British going back on all of that and supplying the Challenger 2s. So it's not impossible that at some point all of these vehicles, Abrams tanks, Leopard 2s, perhaps more Challenger 2s, will be supplied to Ukraine. But then that brings us to the last part of this program, which is, what is the purpose behind all of this? Where is this all going? And there's been a very interesting article by Mike Whitney, which I'm not going to read out for all kinds of reasons, but but he points out that the United States, the neocons running policy in the United States, have failed to think this thing through. And he makes the point, and he makes it, I think, very well. One of the biggest, this is from Mike Whitney, one of the biggest surprises of the current war is simply the lack of preparedness on the part of the United States. One would assume that if the foreign policy mandarins decided to lock horns with the world's biggest nuclear superpower, which is of course Russia, they would have done the necessary planning and preparation to ensure success. Clearly that hasn't happened. US policymakers seem surprised by the fact that the economic sanctions backfired and actually strengthened Russia's economic situation. They also failed to anticipate that the vast majority of countries would not only ignore the sanctions, but proactively explore options for ditching the dollar in their business transactions and in the sale of critical resources. We see the same incompetence in the provision of lethal weapons to Ukraine. How do we explain the fact that the NATO nations have been frantically scraping the bottom of the barrel to find weapons for Ukraine? And by the way, since Mike Whitney published that, there's now been a report that the United States has had to go to Israel, ask Israel for the 300,000 rounds of 155mm ammunition that the United States stockpiled in that country in order to enable the United States to conduct military operations in the Middle East at short notice, and to provide all this ammunition to the United States so that it could in turn be forwarded to Ukraine, who will go through that ammunition in a very short space of time. But anyway, that's another example of this point about scraping the bottom of the barrel to find weapons for Ukraine. And Whitney goes on to say, did our leaders really start a war with Russia not knowing whether they had sufficient supplies of weapons and ammunition to fight the enemy? That appears to be the case. And were our leaders so sure that the conflict would be a low-intensity insurgency that they never planned for a full-blown combined arms ground war? Once again, this appears to be true. These aren't trivial mistakes. The level of incompetence in the planning of this war is beyond anything we've ever seen before. It appears that all the preparation was focused on provoking a Russian invasion, not on the developments that would happen afterwards. What's clear is that the Pentagon never gamed out the actual war itself or the conflict as it is presently unfolding. Otherwise, how does one explain these glaring errors in judgment? One, they never thought the sanctions would backfire. Two, they never thought they'd run out of weapons and ammunition. Three, they never thought Russia's oil receipts would skyrocket. Four, they never thought that the majority of countries would maintain normal relations with Russia. Five, they never figured they'd actually need a coherent military strategy for fighting a ground war in Eastern Europe. I think this is absolutely true. And in fact, it's not difficult to understand why this has happened. Because Mike Whitney asks, did they not think it out? Didn't they game plan it? Well, of course they didn't. And the reason they didn't is because this whole operation was envisaged in advance by a small group of like-minded people, mostly civilians, very little understanding of war, of logistics, of economics, of infrastructure matters, even of legal matters, who didn't seek expert advice because they were deciding things in secret, in the full knowledge that if they discussed their plans in public, the American electorate in particular would almost certainly oppose what it was that they were trying to do. So this is why we are where we are. And as Mike Whitney correctly says, and here I will explain why I'm not going to quote the entire article because it extensively quotes me. But anyway, as Mike Whitney correctly says, whilst the Russians clearly have a plan, while Washington and its allies, the West doesn't. Bottom line, while Washington and its NATO allies do not have a coherent strategy for winning the war in Ukraine, it's clear the Russians do. The stage is now set for a conventional ground war, the likes of which no one in Washington ever anticipated, We expect that the outcome of this conflict will reshape Europe's outdated security architecture and force a realignment that will mark the end of the unipolar era. Well, as to whether the last will happen remains to be seen, but if it does, it will be a huge indictment, not just of Western leaders, but of the way in which political decision-making, geopolitical decision-making in the West is made without consulting the wider public, as ought to be the case in a democracy. Well, again, this has been a very long video. I'm going to stop now. More from me soon. Let me repeat again that you can find all our videos on all our other platforms: Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, and Rockfin, and Telegram. And you can also check out our programs. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. And if you wish, you can check out our shop and buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those things. And last but not least, please also remember to press the like button if you've liked this video, and to check your subscription to this channel. Now, over the course of this video, there's been more and more information trickling in about a helicopter crash in Ukraine, in which apparently the entire leadership, including the minister of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, has been killed. I'm going to discuss that, obviously, in my next program. I doubt that it is particularly consequential in terms of the outcome of this war, but such as it is, I will, of course, discuss it. Well, thank you for joining me again today. As I said, more from me soon.